Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this book roundtable jointly organized by the Max Weber Program and the Political Economy Working Group of the EUI. Today we have the pleasure to discuss a recently published book entitled The Reinvention of Development Banking in the European Union, edited by Daniel Mertens, Matthias Thiemann and Peter Folberding, and published by Oxford University Press. So let me briefly introduce the editors of the volume. Daniel Mertens is professor at the University of Osnabrück, where he landed after having obtained his PhD from the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne and having worked at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Daniel has written extensively on topics related to fiscal policymaking, financialization, and most importantly, development banking in Europe. Matthias Thiemann is an associate professor at Sciences Po Paris, and he obtained his PhD from Columbia University. Matthias too has written extensively on development banking in the EU, but he has also written on the political economy of shadow banking, financial markets, and banking regulation. Peter Folberding instead is now a consultant for Bain & Company, and he decided to move to the private sector after having obtained his PhD from Harvard University with a dissertation on the German Development Bank, KfW, and a focus on the emergence of new financial instruments to promote development. Unfortunately, Peter will not be with us today, and the book will be presented by Daniel and Matthias. However, we have two brilliant discussants with us today, namely Vera Šćepanović and Niels. Vera is a lecturer at the University of Leiden, and her research focuses on industrial policy, economic governance, and the political economy of Eastern European capitalism. Niels is a PhD researcher at the EUI working on finance and development in Eastern European countries. So I look forward to today's discussion on such a crucial topic as development banking. But before leaving the floor to you, I would like to mention a couple of housekeeping rules. So first of all, I have to warn you that this event is being video recorded and will be posted on the Max Weber Program YouTube channel. So I would kindly ask those of you that do not want to be on the record to turn off your cameras. Secondly, we will proceed as follows. We will have a 15-minute presentation by the authors, and then Vera and Niels will both dispose of 15 minutes each to provide feedback on the book. 40 minutes will be spent on the Q&A. I kindly ask you to raise your virtual hands or write in the chat if you want to ask questions, and I will then moderate the flow of the discussion. So this is all from my side, and yeah, Matthias, Daniel, the floor is yours. You should be able to share your screen.
Yes, I think you can see my screen now. The famous words of the pandemic and academic Zoom lectures. Thank you very much, Donato, for this kind introduction and also for this very nice invitation. And the opportunity to introduce and discuss our book, which Matthias and I, as well as Peter, who cannot be here, as you said, we're lucky enough to edit. So, and of course, many thanks to Vera and Niels for taking the time to join our discussion. This is greatly appreciated. So as time is scarce, we'll jump right into it, giving everyone just a quick idea about what this book is basically about and what we think are its main tenets. So at the heart of this book, we basically find a puzzle. And we start with an observation, and that is that development banks, which are state-owned financial institutions with a promotional mandate or a mission, if you will, first have grown considerably since the financial crisis in terms of their size and their operations. So I brought you a little graph illustrating that nicely. As you can see here, the total assets for national development banks in the EU and plus the European Investment Bank have dramatically expanded over the 10 years after the financial crisis, and even a lot of the smaller development banks in Eastern Central Europe or Northern Europe, which are like hidden in the top layer, even those have expanded, if though not all. And this is the first observation we're starting from in this book. And the second one is that we can also observe a number of new foundings of these institutions in EU member states, which formerly did not have such an institution. So that's the case for Portugal, Ireland, Malta, and in the past 2 years, Romania and Greece have also been engaged in founding such a development institution. And the third point is that development banks have gained a novel role in European investment policies post-2008. First in some counter-cyclical activities still under the Barroso Commission, but then particularly in the Juncker Plan, the so-called Juncker Plan, Investment Plan for Europe, which already entailed strong structural policies. Later in the follow-up in the InvestEU program, which is now coming up with the multi-annual financial framework, and also in the proposal for a European Green Deal. So when you look at the sustainable investment pillar of the European Green Deal, that basically hinges on the EIB and national development banks. So in other words, all recently emerging pillars of some sort of a transnational industrial and investment policies recur to some extent to development banks. And so the puzzle, however, then occurs that it's at odds with the view of EU integration as a liberalization machine. So from the perspective of European political economy, the understanding of European integration is basically being a project for liberalization and a constraint of national economic policy making. This has been particularly true for finance. For a long time, the European Commission and the European Court of Justice have been instrumental in pushing for the privatization of public banking in particular. Think Spanish savings banks, German Landesbanken, and there's a whole history of banking privatization surrounding the accession of new member states from Central and Eastern Europe when you think of Rachel Epstein's work and the marketization of bank-state ties. So we are asking what basically explains this puzzle. And our answer that we give in the book, that this is not just a story of counter-cyclical action past the financial crisis, not even primarily, because counter-cyclical action needs capacity building, and that capacity has been somewhere and it has been further built. We rather present an exploration of structural shifts and in national and European economic policy making, and somewhat being part of a quest to develop an infrastructure for transnational industrial policy, one that has a greater lever than cohesion funds have. And for us, there are basically two underpinnings of these structural shifts that we like to put up front. On the one hand, this trend, the phenomenon we observe, is conditioned by the primacy of fiscal austerity and little supranational fiscal capacity. So tapping development banks' capacities and financial means really flow out in the European Union out of a growing concern with low investment within an institutional framework that prevents supranational and national fiscal expansion. And on the other hand, however, it is also conditioned by a market-led turn by key development banks themselves. And that is what we call the reinvention of development bank. It rests on development banks' use of financial instruments, of guarantees, equity, think of venture capital, the expansion of risk-sharing arrangements, and some have even engaged in providing special purpose vehicles for securitization business. So then moving quickly beyond loans, and particularly all the European investment programs rely on the principle, which you can see written here from an EIB event a couple of years back, which was entitled "Doing More with Less." So kind of basically is another phrase for leveraging up scarce fiscal resources and mobilizing private capital for investment. So the very principle lies in the mechanisms that public budgets provide a guarantee or guarantee frame to development banks that allow them to increase their capital market borrowing for expanding their balance sheets. And that is something one could also observe even in the recent pandemic, in the very beginning, to find some crisis responses. So given these shifts, we were searching for a heuristic to understand when, where, and how development banking takes place in the European Union of today, and which will allow us to draw out the interconnections between the evolution of some sort of transnational industrial policy, however incomplete, and the national political economic trajectories in which development banks are embedded in. And what we are turning to is a two-field theoretical approach in the vein of Neil Flickstein and Doug McAdam, through which we trace the emergence of what we call a European field of development banking. And we believe that helps us to make sense of the social relations that underlie the shifts the book is concerned with. And that is where I hand over to Matthias to present how we conceive of this field.
Yeah, hello, and thank you, Daniel. So this is an edited volume, as you may know, and so there are many excellent scholars involved in it. What we want to present to you today, of course, is mostly the theoretical framework that we developed with these scholars jointly and that we then put in our introduction of the book. And maybe one of the most important graphs I will claim in that introduction is the one that you see in front of you that seeks to depict the field of European development banking. Now to start, as you may know, a field in the definition by Flickstein is one in which the actors take each other increasingly into account in what they're doing and as they are cooperating and competing. And so for us, the center of the field of European development banking really is here in the center of the graph, which is what we jokingly call the egg, where you can see the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund jointly and the national development banks that have come together over the last 2 decades to form a set of actors that really cooperate in working together on delivering like tasks that they're given by the European level mostly. And so surrounding this egg that is cooperating but also competing, because all of these national development banks such as KfW really don't like to see the European Investment Bank acting in their backyard. So there's also a lot of competition going on. They are together receiving or increasingly focusing on the European level that we have tried to depict here in the upper left corner, whereby the European Commission, that is seeking to do more with less, is giving European money, that is money of the European budget, to the EIB, most famously through the Juncker Plan, to achieve certain goals such as increasing investment. And the EIB jointly with the EIF then works together with the national development banks to bring this about. And so the carrot in this respect is evidently these financing programs, and we show how they have been expanded and how these actors increasingly come together. And yet there is also a stick. That stick is the regulation that seeks to tell these national development banks and the EIB what they can and cannot do. And there's an interesting dialectic going on here, because as we try to show in the book, these guys being the national development banks, in particular the 5 large ones, the Spanish, the French, German, the Polish, and the Italian, about which Donato has written in his chapter, band together to ask for an easing of European regulation in return for their help for the Juncker Plan. And so this field, of course, is not only structured by the European actors, the national development banks themselves and the member states, but also by capital market actors and by commercial banking. And again, here we find an interesting relationship of cooperation and competition between, for example, the commercial banks and the national development banks, where commercial banks are very careful seeking to make sure that they don't get an additional competitor that they think they cannot compete with because they have a state guarantee on the one hand, but on the other hand, where they collaborate in order to implement these policies, in particular when they are granted favorable guarantee conditions. Most famously, recently we saw this in the COVID crisis, when actors such as the KfW became crucial actors for delivering state aid, so to speak. On the other hand, we also have a strong dependence of this field on capital market actors, both on rating agencies, but also on large actors like Allianz and other insurers, which means that what these banks can do and cannot do is to some degree limited by the rating agencies and by what these capital market actors are interested in financing. And I think, I hope we can have a discussion today about how this all might change in the context of much more public money that is today made available to pursue public policy. So, I mean, I think Daniel and I agree that the conditions that we described in this book have possibly dramatically changed with the COVID crisis and the issuance of Eurobonds. But so these are basically the different constraints that the European field of development bank is facing and that they are embedded in. But lastly, I would like to point out to you that, of course, power structures are really differentially, the power is really differentially distributed in this structure. And this would lead me to the last slide, Daniel, I may, which is when we looked at this field of development banking, we couldn't help but notice that the elephants in the room are the large Western banks that are on average 247 billion euros large, often some of the largest banks in their country, with the largest incumbent today, the EIB. And these actors really provide all kinds of services, and while they do also seek to rake in European money, they actually, but for the EIB, have a lot of domestic activity and domestic prowess going on, so they're not as dependent on European money. Whereas these much smaller banks in Eastern Europe, and in particular in the Baltic, as you can see here, the triangles are depicting the EU money as share of total assets, are really like intermediaries or like pipes to channel European money into these regions, and these institutions really understand themselves as mainly focusing on getting that money into their region, which of course has very different implications for how they pursue their own policies. And there's a very good chapter on the Baltics in it, in which Olga Mikieva and her co-author point out how these guys are literally just have a very managerial perspective in which they're seeking to get all kind of money from the European Union, but they don't have a domestic capacity to really do something about that money, like to develop a coherent, independent regional plan for the Baltics. And so, so here we are, having tried to show you the European field of development banking that is structured by power differentials that currently at least favors the Western parts. And our hope with this book was really that we could put this developing network on the research agenda of others. So we're really happy to present it to you here. And here you can see the structure of the book after we try to introduce the European context in the first 3 chapters, in which we try to detail how these national development banks and the EIB interact using the EU money. We then have a section of regional case studies, of country case studies, starting in the core, so to speak, with Germany, Italy, France, and Spain. Then also making sure that we included Eastern Europe, Northeastern Europe, the Baltics, and also Southeastern Europe with Greece. Some countries we couldn't include, but I mean we're sure the dynamics that we were trying to show, they also apply in these countries. As Daniel mentioned, today pretty much every European country has a development bank, and the reason for that is not a coincidence. It's that the current environment really highly incentivizes national governments to install them, and the European level is even pushing and supporting the installation of these development banks in order to be able to have some policy steer in all of Europe as they pursue their policies. But as I said, we're also trying to point to, even if we cannot fully do it in the book, to point to the differential development and to the differential implications of this network, because some actors are very powerful, such as the KfW or even the Polish Development Bank, and have a big clout in Brussels, such that they can actually have some impact on the rules that affect them. And other actors, such as the Croatian Development Bank or the Bulgarian Development Bank, they'll be simply too small to really make much of a difference in the evolution of the field. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel and Matthias. I will now leave the floor to Niels.
Thank you very much. So I want to start off by saying thank you also on behalf of the Political Economy Working Group who's co-hosting this event today for your availability to be here today and discuss your work, and also for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts here. So I think this is a really impressive and immensely interesting work in a number of respects. The main and perhaps most obvious being that, you know, in spite of the sort of recent resurgence, it's kind of still difficult to come by research on development banks in general, and sort of more recent works in the comparative political economy tradition more particularly. So I was very happy when I first heard about this book getting published, even happier when it got published and I had the chance to read it. So as you partly acknowledged, you know, the future of development banking by Griffith-Jones and Ocampo sort of is one of the first starting points of, you know, this more recent scholarly attention to development banks. But I think, you know, in your focus on Europe, in your comparative perspective, and the theoretical richness you really add to that starting point and depart from it in quite significant ways. Something that I found extremely innovative was your consideration of the multiple roles of development banks. So development banks as self-interest agents, as genuine representations of government's interests, as rule takers, and as also as rule creators on a European level. I think this is also very interesting for researchers interested in industrial policy in Europe more generally, because it provides an extremely comprehensive analysis of a very tangible example of change on a European level, and importantly also the implications of that change for domestic politics, domestic policy making. And lastly, I also found your use of field to be an extremely interesting and useful tool to grasp well, change in general, but, you know, policy and institutional change on a European level in particular. So I think in some of this very important reading for everyone interested in development banks, but also, you know, industrial policy making in Europe. And I want to just offer 3 sets of comments that are all partly related to my own research interest, and as Donata already mentioned, these are related to the emergence of finance or development finance in Central and Eastern Europe. So the first comment relates to the developmental impact of development banks in a sort of more traditional sense of the developmental state literature. And I know, I mean, this is mostly relevant for sort of late development, I guess, but I think in light of the challenges you mentioned regarding sort of green transformation, digitalization, I think this is also relevant for Western Europe. And I think I would be quite interested in hearing your thoughts and how you would actually map development banks and the variation in development banking across Europe with regards to its developmental impact. And I want to specify a little bit more what I mean by that. So something that I'm sometimes missing a little bit is a bit of a clearer framework or even a normative impetus about the developmental challenges that Europe and different countries in Europe are currently facing, and the potential of development banks to overcome these challenges. And a lot of these challenges are, of course, alluded to over the course of the book. They, for example, relate to different forms of financialization, generally constrained industrial policy, various investment gaps, the lack of convergence of different European peripheries, and the sort of lack of public oversight over investment decisions. And the potential of development banks then lie in their ability to forego state aid rules on a European level by creating more public oversight of investment decisions, or democratize finance, so to speak. And they can also assist in concerted and coordinated developmental strategies. And my interest would be to what extent development banks actually live up to that potential. So if the question is sort of what is the developmental impact of development banks, I think you sort of provide 2 answers in the book depending on the context. And the first sort of most, I think, or my impression, most positive answer is in the chapter on France and BP France, which sort of seems to be a very strong representation of developmental finance following a sort of more traditional developmental state framework. So in spite of the constraints of state aid regulation at the European level and also general conditions of marketization, they adopt a very strong focus of financing of innovation and structural transformation. So they seem to have a very large developmental impact. And then there are also a number of more negative answers to that question about, you know, development banks that adopting a less or having a less transformative impact. And I think the most explicit example is just in the conclusion where you mentioned that a lot of national development banks, but also the European investment banks, do not really engage in high-risk activities, but they are seeking low-risk returns. So basically, this de-risking strategy on the funding side is resulting in less risky activities on the lending side. And this somehow was contrary to, the more traditionally ascribed functions of development banks in times when more risk-taking development banks are actually needed, especially in the European peripheries. And I think, Germany and the chapter on Germany are an interesting sort of middle ground here, because what I got from the chapter on Germany in the KfW was that the KfW is very much serving the German growth model, and it's much more about status quo protection and much less about the structural transformation of the German economy. So I'm aware that a sort of actual mapping of development banks as regards their developmental and transformative impact is, part of further research, and you very admirably, I think, open up that research agenda. But I would still be interested in hearing your opinion on the kind of variation you observe. And just finally on that point, I think part of this question actually boils down on how to read and analyze balance sheets of development banks and state-owned financial institutions more generally, and how to then actually, see their developmental impact and compare that across countries. And I think that would be an important and worthwhile undertaking to develop an analytical roadmap in that regard. And now I just want to make two smaller comments. The first one relates to the role of ideology, electoral politics, political competition, and this is something that I found to be quite absent from the book. There are, of course, a lot of references over the course of the book to party competition, especially in the country chapters. Something that I found very interesting, there was the chapter on Greece, because political contestation seems to matter a lot in the sort of failed establishment of development banks or various failed attempts. But I think, overall, there seems to be still a relative absence of these factors, and you can, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this seems to be because of the nature of the underlying explanation for the researchers of industrial policymaking on a European level. And this is, of course, not really the focus of the book, but it seems to be sort of underlying and assumed. So in short, the crisis created and exposed certain investment gaps, and then development banks jumped in to attempted to fill in these investment gaps. And as you acknowledge, still variation remains between different member states. And as you also acknowledge, this variation is for a vast range of reasons. A lot of them are specific and unique to the specific countries. But I still think overall there is a tendency in the book for more structural explanations. So in explaining this variation, you focus on imbalances in capacity and imbalances in power, and there's not really consideration of political competition, electoral competition, or other more political factors, so to speak. And I don't have a necessarily clear-cut idea on how to incorporate these factors myself, but I think you mentioned multiple ways in which ideas, so to speak, generally matter. For example, in the conclusion, you mentioned the lack of a developmental mindset on the part of EU policymakers, which I think sort of raises the question about the magnitude of the change that you actually observe on a European level, both on an ideation level, but also on a sort of institutional and policy level, and how different countries actually differ in that respect. And I think here it is important to open the door to other explanations for that variation. A second example would be the introduction, where you mentioned the importance of economic patriotism, economic nationalism as a motivation for the researchers of development banks. But then over the course of the book, there isn't that large an account of the different shades of the motivation for this resurgence, and whether or not nationalism or patriotism is actually part of this. So I think, just in sum, I think these things can be of some significance in the explanation of different roles of development banks, and in the future should be addressed somehow. And lastly, just one point on Central and Eastern Europe in particular. So this is quite a central theme of the book, the power imbalances and the partly resulting inequalities in capacity of development banks to enact their sort of standalone developmental activity, in their access to European Union funds, and also their ability to influence the rules, the very rules that govern them. So something I would have been interested in is the extent to which and the precise way in which this inequality might be partly engineered by institutions on the European Union level, but also institutions in domestic context of the European core. And this is partly alluded to again in the chapter on Germany and the KfW, where you talk about the, the consultancy work of the KfW being done after the transition in Central Eastern Europe. And you say that, the motivation for this consultancy work on the part of the KfW was not only economic, but also geopolitical. So what I'm wondering in that context is sort of what is the bigger picture here? What is the situation like today? And how does, for example, the enforcement of state aid rules in Central Eastern Europe perpetuate dependence, marketization, and so on? And is this actually in the interest of different countries in the European core? Now, I don't really want to stretch this argument too far, but I think it is important to sort of consider different growth models of countries of the European core and sort of what is in their interest in terms of the economic structures of the markets they're exporting to, and whether or not it's in the interest to actually keep the field of development banking in these countries somehow in check. So I think the bottom line is here that I think there are still certain dimensions of the uneven playing field that you outline over the course of the book that are still not analyzed. And I just want to end by saying that I hope these comments have illustrated that I do think that there's a lot of potential for further research, and I'm extremely grateful to you for providing something that other researchers of development banking can tie into and use as a work of reference, and this just adds to the many merits of the book itself. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Niels, for these comprehensive comments. I think Matthias wants to have a go replying to Niels before we move to Vera, or shall we, what do you prefer, Daniel and Matthias? Shall we have Vera's comments first?
Yes, let's have Vera's comments first and then move into the discussion afterwards. That would be great.
Okay.
I couldn't hear it. Okay, yeah, let's give the floor to Vera. Vera, please, the floor is yours.
Daniel said yes. All right, thank you very, very much. And, same as Niels, thank you for the great opportunity to read the book before it's even properly published. I really, really enjoyed this read, and I am very happy. I'm very grateful for this volume, and I completely agree with Niels in saying it's an amazing thing to have you lay down the groundwork, because I completely agree that I can see multiple agendas, research agendas coming out of this, and you very helpfully outline them as well at the end of your very book. So I think hopefully we will be continuing these conversations for many years to come. What I really, so I am somebody who is interested in industrial policy, knows much less about development banking as such, and I was therefore very excited to see your puzzle and to talk about this evident by now shift at the EU level towards a more of an industrial policy, towards more of the idea that the economy does need to be steered, and that we are creating all kinds of new instruments to do it, which, however, and you do acknowledge that, is very much still in tension with this old notion of the only way of keeping Europe together is through a liberal market, because otherwise you rekindle the ghosts of economic nationalism, and then you get into conflicts. And it's precisely this kind of dynamic that does show up very well, I think, in many parts of the books, and makes it very interesting. Now, what I would like to talk about, the second thing that I think is absolutely that I really liked about it is an institutionalist approach, right? So we were trying to understand which institutions are involved, how they change, how they evolve, and also how the changing of the changing form also influences the changing content. So what is the purpose of industrial policy, and how that is transformed? And I think my comments go very much in the direction of perhaps nudging you to either tell me what you think about this right now, or think about it with two aspects. One is sort of looking rather more closely at the content of this. Is my internet going wrong? No, you can hear me? Excellent. Sorry, the laptop said so. One is sort of looking more inside within this community at the content of ideas that develop around the notion of industrial policy, developmental banking. And the other two comments have to do with the context of it. So the first comment, as I was reading this book, I kept being reminded very vividly of Julia Johnson's Priest of Prosperity, which is a book about the epistemic community that emerges around central banking, especially through the, the ideology of independent central banking, how it crystallizes through small communities ported to the East, and then sort of re-imported as common wisdom, and how this creates a transnational community which has a very strong, she calls it a wormhole, right? It's a very strong idea of methods and policies and ideas that should guide the central banking. And of course, your book is very, very different, right? What you describe is a field that is much more fragmented, where plenty of different types of actors jostle for influence, where development banks are very much tied to the central governments, right? And that they're under their mandate and sort of political guidance. But then I couldn't sort of shake the need to make stronger these parallels. Like, I was wondering, is this really the case? You would imagine central banks to be close to the governments, or were at the beginning of this process as well. So what is happening here, right? You talk in several chapters about the notion of horizontal Europeanization, right? But somehow it's a very bird's eye sort of institutionalist account of the networks that are created. What I was missing was more of an idea of the people within these networks, and how do they think about it? How do they imagine their jobs? What do they think they should be doing as development bankers? And of course, within country studies, this comes out very clearly, right? In Italy, sort of Donato and Fabio write about, sort of the balancing of being the funder of the central government, essentially, buyer of the sovereign bonds, and the more different types of mandates. You talk about sort of changing ideas also within it, right? So in France, splitting off a more agile and a more aggressive, if you want, unit that has more different types of ideas. But as I was thinking how these come together, you mentioned common institutions, exchanges of stuff, conferences, I imagine training programs, cross-border investments as well. How do these people exchange ideas, and do you see anything like a notion of the proper way to do development banking emerging at EU level? Who gets recruited to the European Investment Bank? Why do they have such different ideas than some of the national banks? So this is something I would definitely love to hear more about from you now or in the future. And then the other two comments I had have to do with the context of this development banking. So I very much enjoyed your framing of this through the field theory, and I think it is it's a way that allows you to be very open and honest about something that is very much work in progress, to show that's how the different actors take one another into account, how they do come together, but also very importantly, and I think this is a very valuable contribution of your book, they have very unequal power positions within this, and therefore different ways of influencing the European level policy. Nonetheless, I think staying within this, space of field theory is a bit of a missed opportunity, because you make a lot of I wouldn't say promises, but you make gestures in the introduction saying, oh, this has the potential to tell us more, or to open up a conversation about institutional integration and governance in Europe. This has the potential to talk more to the literature on comparative political economy and comparative capitalisms. But then you don't really. And I think you're absolutely right, and the potential is absolutely there. And one thing that I always get very upset about in all these theories about European governance, right? So multi-level governance or the experimentalist governance, which this sort of structurally looks like, is the lack of notion of inequality, or the uneven playing field, the differences in power. So I think you could potentially open up more of a conversation in that direction, to see what we can learn more about the emerging governance structures within this field. And then the second one is possibly, well, it has to do with the context of development banking, not within the conversation about European governance, but within the discussion of industrial policy more broadly. And here, what I didn't know how to think about as I was reading this book is, if you have such a huge variation of national development banks, and some are different types of institutions, and in some countries they're very fragmented, and some countries don't have them at all. What we do see, and what is a common thread, is you're saying, okay, so this Europeanization process is pushing countries in that direction, to establish the banks, to empower the banks. There, the incentives, there are sticks, there are carrots. There are also, sort of institutional monocropping. We go and we create these banks in Eastern Europe because we need something to channel the money through. But they're not the only ones, right? So they're institutional, they're sort of functional equivalents for financing. There are different channels of getting finance. Now, Matthias mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, now we have this, huge amount of finance being created for through the recovery and resilience funds. So, a lot of the book talks about Invest EU, and of course, given the leverage potential of it, it's supposed to be huge. And so these are all different sources of funding for industrial policy. And then you also have different channels through which the principles of the national development banks, if we do think of them as taking the mandate from the national governments are also being pushed towards certain type of industrial policy through the European semester, through the macroeconomic imbalance procedure. So you kind of have more, an even broader field of industrial policy that is pushing more towards a common European notion of what it's supposed to be. But this somehow falls off. And then, so I think the question would be, how important are the national development banks? So, and why are they so important so differently in different countries? And is it because these countries lack the capacity or the history or the interest, or because they somehow do have equivalents to provide similar services? I think one case which I found very interesting, but also didn't know how to think about, is the one that Matthias writes about, the BP funds, which, you do have a well-established development bank, but then something new is needed, which the bank for some reason cannot do. And then, and there's also a bit of conflict of, of course, this is all contingent on the national development histories, but it sort of is going contrary to the trend that you observe in all the other chapters, which is, let's put everything together under the, Polish Development Fund and so on. So let's create these more centralized forms of development finance. So that's that's I think what all I have to push you to open up the conversation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your ideas on this.
Great, thanks Vera, thanks a lot. So we have a lot of inputs now. I would let Daniel and Matthias to have a round of replies, and then we open the floor to.
Daniel, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go? I can go if you like. Yeah. Okay. You can't see me, but I was nodding a lot. And first of all, let me say thank you very much for these very good and great comments. And they also promise a lot of follow-up, hopefully also by Daniel and me, but also hopefully by you. And I'll just pick up a few things. So first, I find the suggestion of the book Priest of Prosperity that is laying right next to me on my desk highly suggestive, and thank you for helping me see the connection. I think when we are speaking about the reinvention of development banking, we're actually really trying to say that this new mode of doing business that involves, well, you're right. I mean, is it one and only one understanding? No, I don't think so. But I think it has common elements. So the engagement with capital market actors, the provision of risk guarantees and risk like structured products, the engagement in venture capital, and then we get to the edges, right? Like human capital formation is something that the BPE does, but not everybody else does. So will it become a trend? we can't really say it, but we are trying to claim that there is the emergence of a common understanding, and that this common understanding is actually also based on these interactions. And I think the crucial space to watch also for us and for others who are interested is actually in the interactions between national development banks and the DGs, Directorate-Generals, because it's just an interview data point, but somebody, the BPE, pointed out to me how this field really emerged. I mean, he didn't use the language, but how also as a consequence of the DGs today inviting the national development banks when they're thinking about setting up a policy. So when they're thinking about how we are going to do digital infrastructure, they're inviting the national development banks ex ante, and they say, how do we have to structure this so you can use it? So, and this of course brings the different people together, and then they develop a certain notion of what state-of-the-art development banking is, which of course has again to do with the power positions, because you are the powerful one if you can define what the state-of-the-art is, right? And so there's a jostling about this in which it seems the EIB and the EIF is currently winning. The second one, and this is where the governance issues come in, and where I hope, maybe it's too implicit in the chapter with Rubio that I wrote, but we're trying to show how it's really like there is this shared understanding, and there's our shared goals, and then there is the fight for the honeypots. And that fight for the honeypots is not only fought fairly. And some interviews, they spoke to us about, well, blackmailing. They would say, I wouldn't call it blackmailing, but it looked like blackmailing. So it was this, you know, and in other words, certain powerful actors in the European Union, for example, the EIB very consciously use their power and their knowledge that other smaller development banks depend on them to make sure that they do not interfere in this political debate in a way that the EIB would not like. So that is there, and maybe it's too implicit, but we try to show some of it. And the last thing that I would like to add is the question of balance sheet analysis, and I think that's it's a great question Niels asked, and I think it's a crucial task that we have to acquire as we're trying to ask ourselves, well, what is it actually they're doing, and does their action actually make a difference? So if we try to understand what's their industrial policy actually impact, and while we're just at the beginning of it, I think one of the important elements is to look at the risk provisioning that these banks engage in, and whether they go up or not. In simple terms, and this was also in interviews with EIB, former EIB officials and current EIB officials, they always pointed out that the EIB is a great tool, they love their bank, but they could do so much more if they were a little bit less risk averse. So in other words, the development banking model that the EIB is running, and this is not like the Financial Times has written about this 2 years ago, is one where they run on high volume, small fee, small risk. And the entire battle with the European Parliament and the European Commission for 10 years now is that the European Parliament and Commission, they are pushing them into risk, and the EIB says, no, thank you, or the EIB is trying to get around it. And so if you're trying to get to the balance sheet analysis, I think you have to look at where do these companies really openly put their capital at risk. You know, and that's just the first step there. Of course, it's not the end of such a balance sheet analysis, but it's just the first hint that I wanted to share. Daniel?
Okay, let me quickly follow up on this before we open the discussion. Also from my side, thanks a lot, Niels and Vera, for your very, very interesting observations and remarks, and also very friendly remarks, because I can read all your comments as unfulfilled potential. Unfulfilled potential is great, I hope, because it can take us further. And just a few comments where I think it's very interesting to think further. Maybe I can respond to some of them. So one of the themes here is like the developmental mindset. And if I understood Vera correctly, which corresponds to that, is to think about the people within these networks. And I think one way one could take this further is to think about the elites in development banking and what is kind of the professional ethos. Where have they been brought up? So there is, I think there are like first attempts, for example, by also by Cornel Bahn to think about the professional leads in these development banks. I think Sarah Bubb and Alex Kentikalenis have also done some work on this. But of course, we have not really looked at national development banks, in particular the European Union case. For what I know, however, is that I think there are very different career trajectories. And until mid-level careers, for example, you have sometimes a still very bureaucratic mode of being raised in that career, which would make, from my perspective, these institutions so fundamentally interesting from a political science perspective. Is their hybridity, right? There are banks, there are financial actors, but they're also kind of half bureaucracies. So kind of what kind of pulls through in the end, if there is the banker's ethos, or if it's more like the bureaucrat's ethos coming through, is a very interesting thing to make of the developmental mindset. Because when we look at the developmental state literature, which you were alluding to, Niels, and I mean, we took the term from Elizabeth Thurbin's work on Korea, there's very much about, you know, that bureaucratic ethos to subsuming accumulation process under a specific political goal. And I don't think we're seeing that. And I don't think the professional elites are tilting into that direction. But it also kind of, this proper idea about how to do development banking is something that is fought for, and which is a struggle in the field. And that is where we come in with the asymmetries, because some can have more resources to pull through with their understanding of what development banking should do. So if you look at and maybe that, because this is like part of my chapter, and I think that is a very illustrative thing, is think about the KfW, which have turned into that institution, which is mainly a second-tier institution working through commercial banks, right? Giving the capital to commercial banks, they make the risk assessment and then passing it through to the final recipients. So, and that sort of business, doing business, has been a historical compromise in the German context in the post-war era. The interesting thing now is that you find exactly that kind of best practice in the European documents. So when they're searching for, oh, how to do development banking, what would be the best way of doing promotional banking, as the official term, then you would look at SMEs, because that is the best way, that they are constrained in access to finance. That is the best way to kind of legitimize market failure intervention. So there is something which is, I think, something we can like learn more about. But to add something about this, I think maybe to complicate our story a bit, is that there's also a lot of skepticism within some DGs about how that operates. So within DG Comp, for example, when we think about competition policy, there is of course concern about these institutions being like parts of economic nationalist programs. And some are still thinking about the idea, oh, are they corrupt? You know, how much autonomy do they have? Particularly, and this is what commission officials have told me about, like, yeah, we're not sure if we can really run our funds through them, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. And the interesting thing is that these institutions in Central and Eastern Europe, because of the history that they have been aligned with the KfW program before, is that they are saying now to the Commission, but we're operating on the principles of KfW, so fine. So it's kind of a multi-cornered fight, so to speak, where you can try to tap into very different legitimacy aspects of the whole thing to make your point. And maybe then, just because I think some is for the broader discussion, but one of the comments of Niels was to think about political actors and electoral politics. This is certainly something we haven't paid close attention to. In some of the chapters that's more clear than in others. I think Donato and Fabio are talking a little bit about that more than I do, for example. But there is, of course, I think there's so much to learn about this aspect in that phenomenon. But I would like to, in the broader European perspective, there would be a nice way to think about a counterfactual. And that counterfactual would be happening in 2015 when Juncker was elected, and Juncker did have that compromise with the Social Democrats that he has to come up with that investment plan. And to do something against this whole austerity discourse and the destruction basically of whole economies. So the EIB was kind of laying into this, laying an egg into his nest. We can do a lot of things. And the part of that investment plans in the initial conception was, of course, that member state governments should contribute fiscal resources to that from their public budgets. So the first one to jump in and say, we are not paying any fiscal money into that was, of course, Wolfgang Schäuble. What he did was send KfW. And he did that before, because when you think about the first European rescue programs for Greece, so the first German part of guarantee and loans for Greece did never come from the public budget, they came from KfW. So, and he played the same game again, which, however, if you would think about a different composition of political actors and maybe a different distribution of social forces, you could have thought of, like, if there would have been direct fiscal spending involved, maybe that whole thing could have gone into this kind of Marshall Plan direction. And that would be maybe a different conjuncture for development banks as well. So in that way, I think there are interesting intrapoints to think about that. I have a couple of more notes, but I think it would be more interesting for everyone for me to stop talking and go into a discussion. Thanks again.
Great. So I have Sebastian on my list.
Yeah, thanks very much. And hi, Daniel, Matthias. Yeah. Thanks for the presentation of the book, from which I think we can really all learn a lot, because it sheds light on one of these blind spots, perhaps one of the many blind spots in European political economy, which is development banking. And I'm really convinced that we should be taking it more seriously, thanks to your book. And it's in a way difficult to disagree or to push back against anything, especially also after the really great comments from the discussants. But perhaps one thing where I had a bit like clenching my fist under the table was the puzzle being built on the EU as a liberalization machine, which is perhaps, if not a straw man, but a bit one-sided. But I guess the book itself is much more nuanced. So that was maybe just for the presentation also. And I would say it's perhaps more of an open question, of course, whether the EU is just this planner of laissez-faire and liberalization, or to some extent also re-embeds markets. But I guess I can't go too far in that direction, because in other work with Donato and others, we also come out on the liberalization machine side. So anyhow, the only question I would have is one following up on Vera's comment, which is whether you could say more about the extent to which these off-balance sheet fiscal agents interact with actual fiscal policy, and the extent to which they can perhaps even play a role in debt management. And I'm asking this because we had an interesting discussion with Donato the other day in another seminar, where it turned out that the Italian Development Bank in fact holds some perhaps 10% of GDP in liquidity, which is accounted for as national debt, but which could potentially be moved quite easily to another entity, be moved around, and would potentially cut the debt to GDP ratio by the stroke of a pen, sorry, by some 10%. So that's sort of simplifying, but I guess the question would be, is this just an Italian peculiarity, or is there some broader role maybe that development banking can also play for debt management in fiscal policy, etc.? I would be curious to know.
Can I shortly react and then Daniel? Because I mean, first I would like to react to the liberalization machine. Yeah, I think you put it nicely as an empirical question. I think our understanding, or at least mine here, is that it's also a liberalization machine for lack of other means. So for lack of other institutional means, and our point about this network of development banks is exactly to place this provocation that the EU today has or starts to have an institutionalized tool that would allow it to do so much more than just liberalization. That's one. And the second one is, I think, that this tool also, you need to grasp this tool if you want to understand a big part of the industrial policy initiatives that have come out in the last years and that will come out. So to be specific about this, for example, the creation of the first battery producer in Sweden is based on a loan that is provided by the EIB. And so you can, or it's not financing everything, but it's financing a little 500 million of it. So you know, so they are using this tool very actively, and thereby they are clearly moving beyond the liberalization mindset and into an industrial policy mindset. And so, in a sense, if I may, I think we're following up, or we're working on something that German dude has said 150 years ago or so, when he said that humanity always only poses itself the questions that it already has formulated an answer to. In this context, the European Union starts to implement industrial policies also because they have very particular and peculiar, but they have tools to do so. And these particular and peculiar tools to do so are this network of development banks. And so I think if we want to understand the next phase of the European Union, which I agree is not the liberalization machine anymore, or yeah, I think it is in these battlegrounds that we can understand how this new phase of the part of this new phase of the European Union might look like, which also has to do with the developmental mindset. But yeah, Daniel.
Okay, quickly following up, hi Sebastian. So I think we can talk for hours about if there's Polanyi or if there's Hayek in Brussels. But I think what we're particularly interested in here is the history of state banking. And I don't think there is a good case to make that the European Union has been a very embedding thing to happen to state banking across the Union. So if you can point me to any other study of that, which would really make a different case, I'd be happy to read that. But it's particularly in the role of state banking, I don't think it has been given much of leeway to discretionary policy making in member states. But relating to your question about fiscal policy interactions, that is very interesting. And I was fascinated by the CDP case and the role in debt management when I heard this the first time from Donato and Fabio. And there's also a great study you might be aware of, Toby Arbogast, who has been working on that as well. So, but I think it's a peculiar thing for the Italian case that comes out of the history that Donato and Fabio are describing. That is not that development banks, they serve as shareholding institutions, for sure, but not necessarily of direct government bonds, but rather as kind of intermediates for other shareholding structures, for taking shares in formerly public institutions or companies. I think we have a lot of great histories that show us how they've been also instrumental in privatizing, actually. Which makes up them as these ambivalent institutions. So they're not intrinsically progressive. That maybe relates a bit to what Niels was saying in the beginning about a normative standpoint. I personally don't think they are intrinsically progressive just because they are state-owned financial institutions, but they are kind of related to the social forces that kind of set them up and that they can exert control over them. So, and in that regard, you can see how they relate to fiscal policy. They do, of course, have a role in very different ways, not only in the shareholding structure, as I was saying, they can be used for all sorts of things. And if the arrangement, if the governance arrangement, as the statute allows, of course, some of the profits, if they make profits, will go into public budgets, right? And of course, they produce a lot of contingent liabilities. So we are kind of in that regard, the structure we are describing is also a structure that is potentially producing a lot of contingent liabilities, which we might see only unfold with COVID-19 kind of ebbing out, and we see what's really happening now in terms of economic transformation. And notwithstanding that, there has to be risk taken, but the idea is, of course, with these national development banks or these institutions, the institution devices, that you can kind of, from a political reasoning, you can like put these things off your own balance sheet into that bank, right? But one has to acknowledge that it might come back to you at some point, and that there are risks involved, and that these risks have to be taken for, let's say, a green transition. But we cannot say these risks are not there. And I think that's an important point when we talk about the fiscal interactions.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question from Vera, I guess to Daniel.
I have a question to Daniel, which is quite empirical. But I also have a short rejoinder to Matthias on the EU governance, which I think, yeah, but well, you can treat it as a separate one. To Daniel, so I'm completely out of curiosity. I was fascinated by your chapter and found this external mandate of the KfW extremely interesting. But I found myself a bit disappointed that it stopped at this sort of, transfer of knowledge and influence and sometimes funding to the other development banks, because the way I encountered KfW in studying the Balkans is a direct lender for infrastructural projects there. So by sort of supporting the externalization of German companies, it not only it substitutes essentially what these development banks should be doing. And I was wondering how widespread this is or was within the EU member states, even those that were only future member states, and to what extent this. So I was just thinking how you could bring this external dimension, external involvement of certain development banks into your explanation of the structuring of the field. And if I may I? Or do you have somebody else? So just to Matthias, yeah, I love that story about the blackmail. That was one of my favorite parts of the book. And that was exactly when I was thinking, but this is so interesting, because there is this, I was recently forced to read a lot of literature on the structure of EU governance and whatnot. One of the big debates has to do with the rise of agencies which the member states set up in order to control a certain policy area, which has to be controlled jointly, but to bypass the European Commission. And so the argument is always about how the Commission relates to these new agencies and to what extent these are competitive structures, or it tries to bypass them, or how they engage. And this sort of semi-conflict with the European Investment Bank very much reminded me of this. So this is what I meant when I said that to engage explicitly with the literature on EU governance was simply to look at the policy fields outside of development banking and see how you could maybe change the large explanations of the EU integration through that. That's all.
Matthias, Daniel, you want to reply? I don't have anyone else on the list. And I want to ask a question myself, but you can reply.
Okay, it doesn't take long. I mean, because I really confined myself to this brief anecdote about Albania and the airport. But of course, this is a very tricky thing, because basically all development banks with an external mandate, like really development funding institution, development finance institutions, they of course have agreed to not tie aid to a kind of specific support of their own domestic corporations, right? So that is kind of the basic international agreement in the IFC and NDB sector. But of course, they come with like an economic diplomacy travel arrangement usually, right? So there is a lot more when you look into the development finance, development aid literature. What I was after rather was to look at the organizational structure and how it relates. So really not looking at specific projects, and it has to do with a very peculiar build-up and structure of KfW itself. Because if you would compare it then to the French case, for example, you would have a different institution for doing kind of development finance. That's the AfD. It's not in BP France, it's not in CDC, it's in a different institution. But the KfW connects all these different, the external mandate, the internal mandate, the European mandate into one conglomerate. And to that extent, it kind of has some idiosyncratic things happening. But you're totally right. There's a lot of things happening also in the accession period when there was direct lending, which opened the door for KfW and a lot of German companies to really build this export model in what they thought is their old empire, you know, like the East. And to that extent, there's a lot more to research, which I would like to do in the future, or if anyone wants to join me or do it yourself. I think that there's a great project in there.
Mm. And to follow up on the EU governance, I think, if I may, the fascinating aspect for me in this debate with between the EIB and the EU Commission was really that the EU Commission felt that they did not get for their money what they wanted. So they were really upset about the lack of capacity, and that led them to be so dependent on the European Investment Bank. And that's why we see InvestEU. That's why we see this opening up to national development banks and MDBs, because it's basically showing the EIB like it's an expression of this frustration. And I don't know in how far such a frustration can be seen in other areas of EU governance and these independent agencies. But in that respect, I really had the feeling if the European Commission could really source it in or get a bigger, like the governance arrangement really is this weird governance arrangement where the European Commission gives a lot of the money, but has no direct say over what the EIB will do. And that leads to all kind of frictions. Because they're not a shareholder of the EIB, you see? The European member states are, but not the European Commission, which creates some kind of interesting governance arrangements.
So I would like to put myself on the list, and then we have a question from Helen. I have two very direct questions, and one relates to the recovery fund. And my question is, what is the role that national promotional banks could play in the implementation of this of the recovery fund? And the second question relates to the ECB. So what is the connection between the ECB and these national promotional banks, and also perhaps most importantly, the European Investment Bank, right? And I'm asking this question in the context of the assets purchase programs of the ECB, and to what extent, you know, the ECB, in my view, should, but to what extent could support these institutions through these programs. Shall we collect the question from Ellen so that we have the last 10 minutes for your reply?
Yes.
Ellen?
Yes, I'm coming. Can you see me? No. Anyway, thank you very much for this really excellent and stimulating book and presentation. And my questions are very much in the same direction of Donato. So first of all, I would love to hear you elaborate a little bit more on the most recent developments and the relevance there. And the other question I also had was like regarding the relationship between the EIB and the national development banks, in the sense, I mean, you mentioned the EIB as this tool for European policy, and then there's the network of national national development banks, but I'm not so sure, or rather I haven't read the book in enough detail yet to understand. So is this network of national banks, do you see that as a supplementary European tool, or is it something more that could also potentially be in conflict, because that's more something that would potentially also lead to accusations of economic nationalism again?
Yeah, brilliant.
Thanks, Helen. Daniel, Matthias, go ahead, please.
Daniel, you want to go first, or you want me to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So on the relancing and the role of the national development banks, I think it also, so first of all, the first answer is it depends on the national banking systems also, and the capacity of these development banks. Some of them are really equipped to do lending on their own, and they don't need any partners, and they can just install these projects. Others really depend on commercial banks, and I think one aspect that I find fascinating about these agencies or these banks is that they have a lot of expertise and knowledge that other banks often do not have. And that regards, for example, the green transition, that they know, that they have better understanding of where the frontiers are and what is worthy of being supported and what not. So I think in that respect, they can be important partners of governments, providing this knowledge and insight from their role. And at the same time, and Daniel and I were a bit surprised about this a year ago, they have played a remarkably or relatively small role after COVID, other than eating the losses. I mean, I think Daniel can speak much better about the KfW, but the bank that today has the most non-performing loans in France is the BPI France. And the reason for that is because the government told them to eat all the losses. So all of the government support loans that are given to these companies to survive, they're financed by the BPI, and they land on the balance sheet of the BPI. I mean, not all of them, but a big part of them. And so in a sense, they're playing their counter-cyclical role, and to take a not so beautiful American formulation, they're taking one for the team. But of course, that will also drive them back in their capacity to be active agents of any transformation in the future, because their balance sheets will be rather impaired by the crisis. I don't know how it's for Italy, Donato. I would be curious to know what the CDB does in Italy right now, but that's what the BPI does. They're assuming a lot of the losses. And the second question about the EIB and the ECB, for me, is one. The first approximation of an answer can be, yeah, when you do green quantitative easing, if the ECB were to do green quantitative easing, and the EIB really becomes this climate bank as they promise to be, there is an evident connection between the ECB and buying up these bonds that the EIB issues. And that can play a role in terms of like contradicting the EIB's insistence on it being limited to certain risk criteria and so on. And yet currently, I mean, that's not the problem of the EIB. I mean, the EIB refinances at, I don't know, 0%. I mean, you see what I mean? Like, we're living in a financialized capitalism where we're refinancing today is not the problem. I mean, it might be a problem in a few years. Well, right now, you're refinancing at 0%, and if the ECB will also buy up your collateral, US collateral, you'll still refinance at 0%. You see what I mean? Like, I think in the longer term, it might make a difference. I think in the current conjuncture where central banks are, where these development banks, in particular the EIB, finances at zero, it doesn't make, in the short term, that much of a difference. And there's the last question by Helen about the network of national development banks and the EIB. And yes, they are in potential contradiction. And in essence, in the end, they kicked out the EIB. Because the EIB was initially a member of the network, and then after some time, they were like, these guys are just blocking us. Whenever their interests are not our interest, they block us, and so they try to get rid of the EIB. And so, of course, there is a tension there that is not always resolved.
Maybe I can add a few things. So first, to summarize a couple of the things. So thinking about the ECB, of course, Donato, you're right. So all the bonds could be bought up under the public sector purchase program, because all these banks are public sector entities, and they are accounted for even under the Eurostat rules. And they can be bought up by the ECB. However, I think it's also one of these peculiar things happening then in between, like responding to capital market actors as well. I was present at a webinar recently with the EIB, and that question came up, because when the EIB is saying it's transforming into a climate bank, and there needs to be a lot of money mobilized also on the EIB things. Is basically the question, okay, but can you just not expand your balance sheet and the ECB is financing you? And Hoyer, the president of the EIB, declined to comment and said he will not speak about the relations to the ECB, which is basically an answer. But of course, something that one has to delve more into. And I think some colleagues, Josh Ryan Collins and Olga Mikeva from the IPP in London, they are looking at this currently. The recovery fund is a very peculiar thing, also to think about the NDBs. I was thinking, and I think other colleagues are thinking along similar lines, the recovery fund and actually the first kind of, fiscal activity in that regard is kind of a break on the developments we are describing. So I would have to look into every national recovery plan, because they might have different rules and statutes about that. But in generally, this has to be direct fiscal spending on programs. So no financial alchemy. And in that regard, they will not necessarily play a role there, but they will play a role via the European Green Deal and via the expansion of InvestEU. And so that would be the link. And we see how that goes. And finally, maybe something to Helen more generally, beyond the associational politics that Matthias was describing. There is, of course, a long-standing history that is very idiosyncratic between the EIB and very different national financial histories. If we look at the history of the EIB, I mean, it's been under kind of control. The story goes that it's been under the control of Italy in the first 20 to 30 years. With the presidents of the EIB coming from Italy, and that a lot of the money that the EIB in the beginning mobilized in its first year flow to the Mezzogiorno, also via the Banca di Mezzogiorno. And so there was, of course, like a very cooperative kind of ecosystem emerging, which was not merely about competition. In other countries, however, and that is particularly a German story, you would see the KfW on top, and then you have the state level, and each of these German states also have a promotional bank, right? So they all have this. They have like a broad system of public banks, and if there is a supranational bank, which of course its interest is to make business, and tries to kind of compete in a specific area, then you have the competition element bringing to the fore. But that really depends on the specific local context. So you can imagine the EIB becoming more of a partner. That's what they sometimes try to do. They offering global loans to specific countries. But the bigger countries like KfW, for example, they don't have an interest in the products of the EIB. They don't need cheaper financing conditions from the EIB because KfW has the cheapest financing conditions, with the bond being the best safe asset the European Union has. So that is kind of making up all these dynamics, but you will find different historical trajectories about how the EIB cooperates and competes with different national development banks.
Fantastic discussion. Yeah, this is really exciting, and I think we will have many more to come in the next months and years. I mean, we reached our time. It's 6:30, so I think unless anyone wants to make a last comment, a last question.
Well, I think that the issue is that we're reaching a point, we're reaching a very, very good debate. What's the role of the national development banks and the EIB in the current conjuncture? And we don't have the answers yet. We hope that we can convince you also to do some research with us or without us on these issues, and that we can continue the discussion in that sense. Like, and if Istituto per la Ricostruzione, okay, what? Donato, this is what they did in the 1930s, the Italians. Your connection is bad. That's correct.
Sorry, Matthias, I guess we will talk about this maybe via email. My connection is really unstable. I think it's time for us to call it a day. And I thank you all. For me, it was really great fun. And well, yeah, I hope you have a nice weekend and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Donato, and thank you, Niels and Vera, for stepping in. That was great. Thank you all for your comments. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Looking forward to reading the next installments of the research.
Merci. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.